Okay, good morning, everybody. So we are holding in the first chapter of Megillah. We're doing a review. We're up to 12b1. That's Yud base, Amud base. 12b, the top of the page. Bayem Hashvi. We're starting again from Bayem Hashvi. Ketev Lev Hamelech Bayoyin. This is still in the first chapter of the Megillah that the Gemara is going through and interpreting it. So let's do it. On the seventh day, when the king's heart was merry with wine. So the Gemara asks, what was going on until the seventh day? Why is it that we only say that on the seventh day he became inebriated and he was happy with wine? What happened before then? So the Rava tells us the reason is because the Megillah is trying to tell us that the seventh day was Shabbos. And as you will see over the course of the next different teachings, the whole Megillah is relating the miracle. There are details here in the Megillah that are not associated with the miracle. And even though the beginning of the story doesn't seem to be like part of the miraculous story, it seems that in the beginning, it was a tragedy. And it was only later on that the miracle started to happen. What we will see is already from the beginning of the Megillah, right? For example, over here, when it says that on the seventh day, the king's heart was merry with wine, right? It's already starting to speak about the praises of the Jewish people to find a merit by which the Jews would be saved. So the first one we discuss over here is on the seventh day, when the nations of the world, when they drink wine and they get merry, it leads to lewdness and immorality. Whereas when the Jewish people, when they sit and drink and they eat on Shabbos, when they have a Suda on Shabbos, it leads to Divrei Torah and praises of Hashem. The Gemara then goes on to tell us, right, that Achashverosh was joined in the discussion about who's the most beautiful, and he said that his wife, who was from Bavel, a Chaldean, right? She was the most beautiful, and he asked them whether they wanted to see her, and she said they all answered yes, but she should be brought in naked, right? And the Gemara says that this is already the beginning of Hashem exacting measure for measure from those who oppressed the Jewish people. So Vashti oppressed the Jewish girls by bringing them in on Shabbos to work and stripping them naked to work without clothes. So she was punished in a similar manner. And this is what it says in the Pasuk, right? Where that after these things, it says, when the wrath of King Achashverosh subsided, he remembered Vashti. And then it says over there, Ve'es asher sosa, ve'es asher nigzar aleha, what she had done and what had been decreed upon her. And the Gemara interprets this to say that what does it mean that she had done and what was decreed upon her, just like she had done, the same was decreed against her. Obviously, the simple meaning of the pasuk is that she had refused to come to the king, and he had decreed upon her to be killed for not coming. But we're interpreting it slightly different and saying he remembered what she had done to the Jewish girls and how measure for measure she was punished. Then he continues and says that Vashti refused to come to the king, and the Gemara asks, why didn't she want to come? We just mentioned in the Gemara yesterday, right, that Vashti was as immoral as Achashverosh. So why wouldn't she want to come? So the Gemara says because she all of a sudden broke out with Saras, and it was told in the Brisa that the angel Gabriel came and made her grow a tail. So for those reasons, she didn't want to come. And then it says that the king was very angry, not just angry, but very angry. Now, why was he very angry? So the Gemara says, it's not that she refused to come. That's not all that happened. When she refused to come to the king, what happened was she sent him a message, and this message infuriated him. What was the message? The message was, she basically said, look, you're a stable boy. My father, who was the king, was able to handle his wine, he was able to drink as much as 1,000 people. Obviously, that's an exaggeration, but the point is he was able to drink a lot of wine and had you drink a little and you're already inebriated, you're already drunk. And he got very upset, very angry. And he didn't know what to do with his wife. So the Megillah records that he turned to the Chachamim. Now, who are these Chachamim? Who are these wise men? So the Gemara says, literally, these are the Chachamim, our rabbis. Those wise men, they're the rabbis. How do we know that it's referring to the rabbis? And he says, because it describes them as people who know the times. What does it mean who know the times? It means the people who know how to intercalate the years and to establish the months of the Jewish calendar. And that's obviously the Chachamim. And he said to them, Achashverosh said to them, judge her for me, judge Vashti for me. What should I do with her? She has disrespected me. She has refused to come, and she has sent me such a message. What do I do? To which the rabbis were in a dilemma. They didn't know what to do, between a rock and a hard place. So they said to themselves, what should we do? Should we kill her? Then what's going to happen is the alcohol is going to wear off. He's going to sober up, and then he's going to blame us for killing her. If we're going to say, just let her go unpunished, well, then we're disrespecting the king. So they said to him, ever since the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed and we were sent into exile, our ability to be able to give counsel has been taken away from us. And therefore, we don't know anymore how to deal with capital cases. So therefore, you have to go to Ammon and Moab, who they are still settled in their place. They're still living on their own land. They're like wine that sits on its sediments. And so since they haven't experienced this upheaval and the relocation, so therefore, these people are the best people to give you advice.
Rabbi.
Yes.
When they said to the king, bring her naked, is that not insulting the king?
Well, if you consider, how immoral Achashverosh was, and he was sitting amongst his own kind, it seems that this was an acceptable discussion amongst them, right? So, you know what, without saying any names, this past week, I went to somebody's house for Shabbos, and this is the first time ever I went to a house where the men and the women sit separately at the Shabbos table, right? And it was very strange to me, and it was very strange to my wife. You know, I grew up in a very religious and observant community, and I've never seen this. So I asked, what is this? So the Balabas said that this is the most sneeze way to do it. So I said, okay, listen, you learn new things every day. And I haven't seen this bother people, but fine, what does it say? Everything that the Balabais tells you to do, you do. Besides if he tells you to get out, right? So I said, okay, fine. Anyway, during the course of the meal, there were many interesting discussions that we had, right? Women sitting separately and men sitting separately. Some of the discussions that came up would not have been able to have been freely spoken about if there would have been the women part of the discussion. Obviously, it wasn't immodest or anything like that. It was, it was related to Torah, but there were certain issues in the Torah that wouldn't have been as easy to discuss if we would have all been sitting together. But one of the guests turned around to me and said to me, and said, you see, if we would have all been sitting together, right, we wouldn't have been able to. So in other words, what he was saying is when you're sitting in a certain company, yeah, you feel comfortable to discuss certain things, right? Even if you're a rabbi and this, that, the other. And at the same time, if other people are present, you don't feel comfortable. It seems that Achashverosh was in company that he felt totally comfortable speaking about things in such a manner, which obviously, which obviously is something that is not a praise for Achashverosh, but it's a reality. So so I don't think they were being disrespectful to him. I think they were speaking to him in a way that they anticipated he would appreciate. Unfortunately, okay.
He was speaking to them the same way.
That's correct. That's correct. Because I mean, if
He
you
tells
hear,
them that his wife is not a Parsi, not a Madai, she's a Kashbi.
right, and the way he referred to her, the way he referred
Right,
to her as the vessel that I use, right, was a
right.
lewd way of describing her. So that's that. So the Gemara continues and says that the rabbis responded to Achashverosh was actually well said. In other words, it was reasonable, because it brings a pasuk. It says that Moav had been at ease from his youth, and he is settled on his sediments, right, and has not been poured from vessel to vessel, nor has he gone into exile. So therefore, his taste has remained in him, and his scent has not changed. So that's why when the rabbis said something, it didn't even sound strange. It sounded very reasonable that they would say something like that, because after all, it is fair to say that they're not settled and they're not therefore able to deal with capital cases. Well, what happened? We read in the Megillah that he heeded their advice, and then it says, and the one closest to him was Kash Noshesa and Mosos Arshish. Now, before we go on to say what happened, as I mentioned at the beginning of the share, everything that we're reading in the Megillah is part of the miracle. And so Reb Levi says that this whole pasuk can be interpreted on the karbanos. It can be a symbolic of the karbanos, which means to say that when it says karshana, for example, what this means is that the ministering angels came before Hashem, and they started to try and speak in the merit of the Jewish people, and they said to Hashem, Master of the universe, did they, meaning the Gentiles, offer before you lambs of the first year? This is a homiletic way of reading the word karshana. Were they the ones who brought a lamb of the first year? Shesa. What does Shesa mean? Did the Malachim was saying to Hashem, did the Gentiles ever offer before you 2 turtle doves? Admosa, did they ever bring to you an altar of earth like the Jewish people have? Did they ever build that for you? Tarshish, what does that mean? Did the Gentiles ever minister before you in the priestly garments? As it says with regards to the garments of the priests, it says Tarshish, Shoyam, and Yoshver. What does Meres mean? So Reb Levi interprets this also as part of the conversation between the angels and Hashem. They asking Hashem, did the Gentiles ever stir the blood of the sacrifices before you? Marsana, did they ever stir the mincha offerings before you? And then when it says Memuchan, Reb Levi interprets it as a question to Hashem. Did the Gentiles ever prepare a table before you? So the word prepare, Memuchan, prepare, is again, have they prepared a table for you as the Jews have? And even though this is during the feast, the very feast that the Talmudim, the students of Rav Shimon Bar Yochai said was the reason why they deserved to be exterminated, even while that was happening, right? Nevertheless, the Malachi Asheres were already, during that Suda, speaking in the merit of the Jewish people to try and save them. So then Megillah continues that Memuchan jumped in and spoke, right? It says, Vayem Memuchan. Now just remember, right? Just remember, in the list, right? It says, Kashno Shisa and Mosos Arshish, Meres Marstana, Memuchan. So Memuchan comes right at the end. But Memuchan is the one that pipes up. So Memuchan, who was this Memuchan? Memuchan was Haman, right? Why was he called Memuchan? If it was really Haman, why is he called Memuchan? Because he was prepared or destined for punishment. That's what it means, because he was destined to be hanged. So Rav Kana says, from here we see that a boar leaps to the front. But he was mentioned at the end because he was the least prominent, right? He was the least of all of them, and nevertheless, he jumped up and spoke before all of them. Okay, continuing on in the Megillah, and based on Memuchan's advice, Achashverosh sent a proclamation through his empire, throughout his empire, declaring that what? That every man should rule in his own house. Now, Rava says, again, this is all part of the miracle, that if not for this first letter that was sent out with this proclamation that every man should rule in his house, then none of the Jewish people would have remained when the second letter went out. Why? How did this avert the catastrophe? He says because when the nations of the world, when all the people under the jurisdiction of Achashverosh saw the first letter that said that every man should rule in his house, they didn't understand. Like, is this a joke? I mean, this is so obvious, right? Even a lowly weaver, right, should be the authority in his own house. Why do you need to send a letter saying that you need to be a ruler? Or that each man should be a ruler over his own house. So that's why when they received the second letter, they didn't know when it said to kill the Jews, right? Was this serious or was it a joke? They didn't know. Had they thought it was serious, not for the first letter, then they wouldn't have waited till the next year. They would have immediately done this. So this, again, this is all part of the miracle of saving the Jewish people. Then he goes on to say that the king appointed officers to go and gather together all the beautiful young maidens. And then he followed, the Achashverosh followed the advice. So Rav said, what's the meaning when it says that every prudent man acts with knowledge, but a fool spreads out his folly? So it says, the beginning of the pasuk refers to David, right? Why? Because two kings set out to gather in women for them. One was David, and the other was Achashverosh. What does it say about David? So David said to him, let me seek for my master, the king, a young maiden to attend him. And since the people knew that the king sought only one maiden, right? As it says, a young maiden. So therefore, anybody who had a daughter wanted to send them off to the king, hoping to be chosen because they knew that there would be a selection. And once their daughter had been chosen, that would be it. Whereas when it comes to Achashverosh, where it says that he appointed officers to gather all the maidens, people saw that Achashverosh wanted every maiden to be brought to his palace so that he can have relations with them, right? And then after having relations with each of them, he would only take one wife. So everybody who had a daughter said, forget it. I'm going to hide my daughter. Why should she be violated, right? And ultimately, perhaps she wouldn't be chosen as a wife. So one was considered prudent and one was considered a fool. Okay, Megilla continues.
Rebbe?
Yes.
Ram has a question. Mordechai has a
I'm sorry. Yes.
Back when it was saying about Memuchan, where he jumped in even though he was the least of them, I think the commentaries also say that when Eliezer was speaking to Besuel and Lavan, Lavan is the one who answers, and the commentaries say the same thing about that he shouldn't have been the one answering. Besuel should have been the one answering.
Right. It's laying out a principle that it says Shiva Dvarim b'chacham v'chilufeim b'golam. There are 7 things, 7 signs of a chacham, and the opposite is with a golam. Right, and one of the things is somebody who speaks in front of somebody who's greater than him. If you have somebody who's greater than you, then keep your mouth shut. They have, So it's true. It's interesting when it comes to the laws of kibbud av va'em. Very interesting. Not many people know this. Not only is it forbidden for you to contradict your father, it is forbidden for you to say my father is right in front of him, right? Which is strange. But that's the halacha. The halacha is that if your father says something, you have to keep quiet. You don't say anything. You don't say he is right. You don't say he is wrong. You just keep quiet. Even to come in front of other people and say my father's right is disrespectful. Why? Perhaps it's because, it looks as if your father needs your approbation, as if he needs your thing. So the idea is one should never speak in front of somebody who is greater than you. You should keep quiet. Okay, so now the Megillah continues. Says Ish Yehudi Hoya B'Shushan Habira, and then it says his name is Mordechai. So first, in the beginning of the pasuk, he's called a Yehudi, and then at the end of the pasuk, it's called Ish Yemini, a Benjaminite. So the Gemara asks, what does it mean by mentioning all these names? If you're coming to trace his lineage, well then, so keep going and mention all the names all the way back to Binyamin. So why do you mention these 3 names? different from all the other names which are not mentioned. So therefore, there's a brisa that that expounds on this and says that all the names cited in the pasuk, Ben Yair, Ben Shimi, Ben Kish, right, all are different designations for Mordechai himself. In other words, these were descriptive terms to describe to us about the virtues of Mordechai, right? One, when it says Ben Yair, it means that he was a son who brightened the eyes of the Jewish people through his prayers. When it says Ben Shimi, it means he's called the son of Shimi because he was a son whose prayers Hashem heeded. Ben Kish means that he knocked on the gates of mercy, asking for the Jewish people to be saved, and these gates were opened up for him. So then what's the idea of tracing him back to Yehuda, calling him a Yehudi, and then saying he comes from from Binyamin? So that's what the Gemara asks. In the beginning, we see that he comes from Yehuda. At the end, it seems that he comes from Binyamin. So which one was his actual tribe? So Rav Nachman says that Mordechai was crowned with his names, meaning honorable names of both his father and his mother's tribes, right? So he came from both. He came from Yehuda and he came from Binyamin, and both of them wanted to take credit. Rabba Baba Chana said in the name of Rabbi Shimon Levi, his father was from Binyamin and his mother was from Yehuda. The Rabbanan say that the two families, meaning the two tribes, were arguing with each other, each one trying to take credit for Mordechai's birth. The people of Yehuda says, I'm the one that caused, it's like, in other words, from the side of Yehuda, I'm the one that caused that Mordechai should be born. Why? Because there's an interesting story that when David HaMelech was running away from Shaul, right, there was a guy named Shimi ben Gera, and Shimi ben Gera came out and he started cursing David HaMelech, and the men of David HaMelech wanted to kill Shimi ben Gera, and David HaMelech spared his life and said, no, don't kill him. Hashem told him to curse me and just leave him alone, right? Now, when we say in the pasuk, right, it says Ish Yehudi Haya b'Shushan Abira Ushumai Mordechai ben Yair ben Shimi. Who's this Shimi? This is Shimi ben Gera. So if not for David HaMelech not saving the life of Shimi, then Mordechai would never be born. So that's why they wanted to take credit. Or Mishpachas Binyamin, they would come along and say, no, he actually descends from us. Yes, maybe David HaMelech didn't kill Shimi, but ultimately, which tribe does he come from? He comes from the tribe of Binyamin. Rava comes along and says, actually, the people of the Jewish people said the opposite. In other words, they were blaming Mordechai and not crediting him, right? They were saying, but each one was blaming the other, right? The Binyamin, people from Binyamin and the other Jewish people were saying, look what Yehuda did to me, right? And what a Benjaminite paid me. What happened? If David HaMelech had killed Shimi, then Mordechai would never have been born. If Mordechai had never been born, he would never have provoked Haman by not bowing down. Had he not provoked Haman by not bowing down, then the whole decree would never have happened. So in other words, you can never get it right, right? Someone's always going to complain. So the Jewish people, right, when the Megillah traces back Mordechai to Yehuda and Binyamin, it wasn't to teach us that they were both arguing to take credit, but rather everybody was blaming Yehuda and Binyamin for the downfall of the Jewish people, for the decree that happened. And why are they blaming Binyamin? Because if Shaul had killed Agag, then what would happen is Haman would never have been born. What's that got to do with Mordechai? Anyway, I guess the point here is that the pasuk is alluding to the fact that both Yehuda and Binyamin were being criticized at this point. Okay, so now the Gemara offers another resolution and says that Rabbi Yechanan says that really he came from Binyamin. So why is he called Yehudi? Very important, because somebody who denies idolatry, who repudiates idolatry, right, is considered to be a Yehudi, right? It's called Yehudi. How do we see this? We see this with regard to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, that they didn't bow down to the statue of Nebuchadnezzar, and they're called Judites, right? And so this is the idea of people who didn't bow down to idols are called Yehudi. Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, when he would start teaching this lecture on Divrei HaYamim, he would say like this. We just quoted a pasuk over here in the Megillah that has a number of names. And we're saying that these names are not just names, but they're also titles. And sometimes it's more for the title than it is for the historical figure that we're mentioning in the pasuk. So Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, right, the Gemara brings by saying when he was about to teach about Divrei Yamim, he would say that all your words are one, meaning all the words in the book of Divrei Yamim are one, and we know how to interpret them. What this means is that many names in the book of Divrei Yamim actually refer to a single person. You have one person, and we have a number of names that are mentioned in the same verse. You could theoretically interpret it to mean different people, or you could understand that all these names referring to the same person. Okay, so he says, for example, right? It says, and his wife.
Rabbi,
Yes.
If I can just say something about the thing before that you said something about what has Haman to do with it. I think Haman was born because of Shaul HaMelech. And he's from Benjamin. So maybe that's why they brought it in when you talk about
No,
Benjamin and Yehuda.
I understand that. My question wasn't what's it got to do with Haman. My question is what's it got to do with Mordechai? When you say that Ish Yehudi Hoya B'Shushan Habira or Shemai Mordechai, Ben Yoel, Ben Shimi.
But we talked about Benjamin and Yehuda. So they mentioned Yehuda is responsible for Mordechai. Benjamin is responsible for Haman.
I understand that, but why? So then, why are you connecting Mordechai back to Binyamin? Like, where's the link for Mordechai? Why are you linking Mordechai to Haman?
It's not. It's just that one tribe is responsible for one, and the other tribe is responsible for the other.
That's pshat. I understand that. That's the pshat. Yeah. I just don't see why that had to be brought into the pasuk, which talks about Mordechai. But anyway.
Okay.
So looking at the verse in the book of Divrei Yamim, it says, "V'ishtoi ha-Yehudiya yoldas yered avi gdor v'eschever avi soichoi v'sikusiel avi zonoyach." Okay, so here we have the pasuk describing how his wife, who was a Yehudiya, whoever that is, we'll see who that is in a minute, right? Gave birth to Yered Avi Gedor and Techever Avi Soichai and Yekusiel Avi Zonayach. It sounds like a whole bunch of different people. And we're going to see, Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi tells us as follows. Why was she called Yehudiya? If you're telling me at the end of the pasuk that in fact it was Brisya, the daughter of Parai. So it says because she denied Avodah Zarah, right? As it says, she went down to bathe in the water in the Nile, in the river. What she was doing is that she was going to rinse herself and cleanse herself from the idolatry of her father's house. So we see that she denied Avodah Zarah, that's why she's called a Yehudiya. But then it goes on to say that she gave birth. Who did she give birth to? Yered, Chever, and Yekusiel, which are names that all refer to Moshe, as we're going to say. So before we go any further, we say, what? She gave birth to him? She gave birth to this Moshe? But she only raised him. She didn't give birth to him. So the Gemara tells us that from here we learn that anybody who raises an orphan, it's as if they've given birth to them. And that's why many people who unfortunately are not able to have children, one of the ways they want to fulfill the obligation to have children is by raising them, because once you raise them, it's as if you've given birth to them. So the Gemara continues and says that Yered refers to Moshe. And why is his name Yered? Because the manna came down, Yered came down because of him in his days for the Jewish people. And why is he called Gedor? Because he fenced in the breaches of the Jewish people, right? This is a reference of giving them Torah which corrected the improper behavior of the Jewish people that they learned from Mitzrayim. Why is he called Chever? Because he connected the Jewish people to their Father in heaven, right? And so, Soichai, the reason why it's called Soichai is because he was like a protective covering for the Jewish people, that he saved them from punishment through his tefillos to Hashem, through his prayers. And the reason why it's called Yikusiel is because the Jewish people looked with hope towards Hashem in his days. Zanuach, the reason why it's called Zanuach is because he cast off the sins of the Jewish people, right? Through his prayers, Hashem forgave the Jewish people. And why does it say Avi 3 times? Why does it say father of 3 times? It tells us he was a father, meaning a leader in Torah. He was a father, meaning a leader in Chachma, wisdom. And he was a father, a leader in prophecy. So now, what we see so far is there are a number of names mentioned here, and all those names refer to who? The same person. They refer to Moshe. And when it says these are the daughters, the sons of Bisya, right? Asher Lokach Mered. Now, who's this Mered? Right? Was his name Mered? I thought his name was Kalev. She married Kalev. Why is Kalev called Mered? So it says because Hashem said, let Kalev, who was Mered, who rebelled against the plan of the spies, come and marry this one who rebelled against the idolatry of her father. So now that's the end of that. And now the Gemara goes back to the exposition of the Megillah and says as follows. It says about Mordechai that he had been exiled from Yerushalayim. So Rava says, when it says he had been exiled, right, it teaches us that he went into exile of his own will, and he was not forced to go with the others. In other words, he could have stayed in Eretz Yisrael, but he chose to go down. Now it says by he these are the next verses in the Megillah in chapter 2 over there. It says Mordechai raised Hadassah. Who's Hadassah? This is Esther. Now, why is she called Hadassah? That's what the Gemara wants to know. Again, now we're going through different names and trying to give meanings to the names. Why is she called Hadassah? Right? Why does the pasuk call her Hadassah and call her Esther, which was actually her name? So we're going to have different opinions. Remeah says her actual name was actually Esther. And why is she called Hadassah? Because of the righteous, the designation of the righteous who are called Hadassim, who are called myrtles. And this is what it says: "Who I made Bein Hadassim," and he was standing among the myrtle bushes. So this is a reference to tzaddikim. This is in the book of Zechariah. So now, Yehuda says that actually her name was Hadassah. That was her real name. And why was she called Esther? Because she concealed her origin. She didn't, like it says in the pasuk, that Esther would not tell anything about where she came from, who her people was. And Nehemiah says that her name was Hadassah. Why was she called Esther? Because the nations of the world used to call her after the moon, right? Because basically saying that she was as beautiful as the moon. Then Azai says that Esther, she was not too tall, not too short. She was average, she was perfect size, like a Hadassah, like a myrtle branch, right? Now, Shulman Korcha says that when we talk about Esther and her appearances, she was actually she had a greenish complexion, right? And like that of a Hadass. However, Hashem gave her a touch of grace, which caused her to be beautiful in front of all the nations and in front of Achashverosh. The Megillah continues to say that Mordechai was the one that raised her because she had no father or mother. And then it goes on to say, right? When her father and her mother had died. Why do you need to repeat it? Once you say she has no father or mother, why do you need to say that after her father and mother passed away, Mordechai took her? So Rav Akka says that what happened was Esther's mother conceived her, and then her father died. But when her mother gave birth to her, she died during childbirth. She died at the birth. Okay, the Gemara says that when her father and her mother died, Mordechai took her as his daughter, right? So Tana says, now what does it mean that as a daughter, don't read it as daughter, but rather read it as house. And house is euphemism to describe somebody's wife, right? And this is what it says. And the poor man had nothing except for the little sheep which he had bought. And it says, and he raised her, and she grew up together with him and with his children. And she would eat from his bread, and she would drink from his cup, and she would lie in his bosom, and she was like a daughter to him. What's the story over here? The story is, just give me 1 second, sorry. The story is with David HaMelech and Nosson HaNavi. Nosson HaNavi comes after David HaMelech had taken Bathsheba, and the whole story with Uriah the Hittite, and Hashem said Nosson to rebuke him. And the way he came to rebuke him was by giving him a parable of a poor man who had nothing, and the rich man took away this one little sheep that he had. And when he goes on describing this little sheep, one of the things is that he says that that she would lie in his bosom, and she was like a daughter to him. So the Gemara says, what does it mean? Because she would lie in his bosom, she was a daughter to him. What does this mean? Rather, don't read it as a daughter, but rather as a home, meaning to say that what the Nosson Hanavi was alluding to David HaMelech is that this was so precious to him, like a wife, right? And then David HaMelech said what he said, and Nosson Hanavi turned around and said, well, this is actually you, right? Because you took the only wife of Uriah the Hittite, right? So therefore, based on that interpretation, where we see bas can be interpreted as bias, meaning a home or a wife, so to over here, when it says that Mordechai took her as a daughter, you should not read it as a daughter, but as a house, meaning to say Mordechai married her. Okay, the Gemara continues and tells us about how the fact that Esther had seven maidens. Why 7? So he says, so Rava says the reason why it was 7 is they would swap, they would change every day, and this way she would know what day of the week it was, right? Or she would know when Shabbos is. And it says, and he changed her and her maidens. So it says this pasuk implies that Haggai, who was the custodian of the maidens, did something special for Esther and her maids that he did not do for the other maidens. What was this? So there's a dispute. What happened? One say that, you know what? She was given kosher food, even though they didn't know whether she was Jewish or not, but they knew that she grew up in the house of Mordechai, and so as a special favor to her, they gave her kosher food. Shmuel says no, they gave her fatty bacon, right? The Yechanan says that no, actually, he gave her seeds, and this is also similar to what happened when Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah came down to Bavel, and in the kitchen of the king, it says that the stewards took away their food and gave them seeds. And this is also, maybe this, one of the reasons why we have hamantashen. Montashen is really pockets of seeds, and this idea of the seeds is this is food that the Jewish people ate when they weren't able to eat any kosher food. So that's what happened in the time of Daniel, Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah, and it's also what happens in the time of Esther, that instead of giving her all the non-kosher food, they gave her seeds to eat. Okay, Megilla says that among the treatments that were used by the maidens before they came to see Achashverosh, right? They would spend 6 months with oil of myrrh, right? What is this oil of myrrh? So Rabbi Chia Bar Abba says this is balsam oil, and Rabbi Huna says it was actually olive oil of myrrh is oil of olives that have not attained 1/3 of their normal growth. I guess that has special properties in it that help a person look beautiful. It was also taught in the Brisa with regards to this type of oil. Rabbi Huda says on pakia is oil of olives that have not attained 1/3 of their normal growth. And why do people smear this oil on their bodies? Because it removes the hair and it causes their skin to glow. That's why they use this oil. Then the Megillah tells us about what happened when each one came to the king. It says that in the evening she would come, and the next morning she would return to the second house of the women. and then they would never go back unless she was called again. So Rabbi Yechanan says that from the account of the disgraceful behavior of Achashverosh, that he consorted with so many women and then sent them away, we learn a positive aspect about him. And what is that? We're told in the Megillah, that in the evening she would come and in the morning she would return. That teaches us that he wouldn't have marital relations during the day. He would only have it by night, which is praiseworthy. Then it says that Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. So Rabbi Elazar says that this teaches us that everybody, that she appeared to everybody according, as a member of their own nation. As we mentioned this before in the Gemara, we mentioned this opinion, because people find that if they think that somebody comes from their nation, there's a special grace that this person finds in their eyes, being that they identify with each other coming from the same nation. Then it says that Esther was taken to Achashverosh in the 10th month, which is the month of Teves. Why is that an important detail? The Gemara tells us that this is part of the miracle, because this is the month which is cold, right? The month of Teves is a cold month, and it's a month where one body derives pleasure from another body, and this way it would make Esther more desirable to Achashverosh. And it says that then the Megillah continues that Esther was loved more than all the other women, and she found favor and grace in front of all, and more than all the other virgins. So Rav says, what happened was, if Achashverosh desired to experience a virgin, then that's what the experience he would have. If he wanted to experience a non-virgin, then that's what he would experience with Esther. And this way, at every moment, he was feeling that his desire was being fulfilled. Then, after he made Esther the queen, the Megillah tells us that he made a great banquet. Now, what was the point of this banquet? So basically, it seems that what Achashverosh really wanted is he wanted to know, who are you? Where do you come from? Who's your ancestors? You know, which kind of people do you come from? So he made a feast in her honor, and she still did not reveal anything to him. And he remitted taxes for the people in her name, and hoping that she would appreciate that, and then reveal to him where she came from. She refused. And then he sent gifts to important people in her name, and still she refused. Then the Megillah, all of a sudden, when it continues, it says, and then the maidens were gathered together a second time. And then what does it say? And Mordechai sitting at the gates of the king. Now, what's the connection with Basulis coming a second time and maidens gathering together? Maidens gathering together and Mordechai sitting at the gate. So it says, because what it's trying to tell us is that Achashverosh was obsessed in trying to find out who she was. Who are you? And he couldn't break her. There was no way to get it out of her. So he went to Mordechai and he asked Mordechai, give me some advice. How can I induce Esther to tell me where she's from? So Mordechai said, a woman is not made jealous except through intimacy with another woman. And that's why they gathered together more people. Obviously, what Mordechai had hoped is he would find somebody else and leave Esther alone, right? So, but what Achashverosh did was he followed the advice, and still she didn't reveal her origins. As it says, Esther did not tell of her kindred. The Gemara digresses for a minute, and then it goes to say as follows. Rabbi Elazar says, what does it mean when it says in the pasuk? And here we go to Yud Gimel Amud Beis. Lo yigra mitzadik einav. Hashem does not withdraw his eyes from a righteous person, right? Which means to say that Hashem is ever mindful of the deeds of the righteous, and he rewards them measure for measure, even generations later, right? You know, I once heard that in our day, right, what happened was many Jewish people, right, came from Europe, and they prayed and prayed and prayed that their children would follow in their path. And unfortunately, we know that many people who came from Europe, they lost their children to assimilation, which means to say that even if they didn't marry out, they still married in, but nevertheless, the children, right, didn't follow in their ways, and they completely abandoned the religion. They completely abandoned Torah observance. What happened to the prayers of all these people? What happened to the prayers of all these people from Europe? So I heard once beautiful idea, and that is that Hashem listened to their prayer, and while the prayer was not fulfilled with the next generation, it was the subsequent generation, and that's the tshuva movement, the return movement, where so many Jews came back to their roots. Well, why did they come back to their roots? Perhaps it was because of all the prayers of their grandparents that their children should continue on in their ways, that although it skipped a generation, but ultimately Hashem heard their prayers and fulfilled their prayers. So we see is over here, actually it says in davening, right, that on Rosh Hashanah, we say about Hashem, Hashem remembers the things that were forgotten, right? What does that mean? Generally, we understand that as, although I only can remember these sins, but Hashem remembers all the sins that I've forgotten. But another interpretation is that Hashem remembers all the mitzvahs that you forgot, right? Hashem never forgets the mitzvahs that you forgot that you did. So ultimately, the point here is that when somebody does something good, or when a righteous person does something good, Hashem repays it. And so therefore, it goes on to tell us that this, we see that as a reward for the modesty that was exhibited by Rachel. She merited that Shaul HaMelech should come from her, because remember, Rachel was the mother of Yosef and Binyamin, and Shaul comes from Binyamin, right? And then it goes on to say that in the merit of the modesty of Shaul, he merited to have that Esther should descend from him. She too was modest. What was the modesty of Rachel? So we see that it says that Yaakov told Rachel that he was a brother of her father. Now, the truth of the matter is, right? Yaakov wanted to marry Rachel. So he's telling her that I'm a brother I'm a brother of your father, but that's not correct. You're not a brother of my father. You're actually a nephew. So what was going on? So we say it like this: he was asking her, "Will you marry me?" She said, "I'd love to marry you, but I'm telling you, my father is a deceiver. So you're not going to be able to outwit him, and he's not going to let you marry me because he's going to give you my sister first." So he says, "Listen, I'm his brother in deceit," which means to say, don't worry about it. I will be able to outwit him. So she said to him, "What, is a righteous person allowed to be deceitful?" So he said, "Yes," right? As it says, with a pure person, you act purely, and with a crooked person, you act crookedly. So Yaakov asked her, what's the deceit that he's going to use against me? So she said, "Listen, I've got a sister, and he's not going to let me marry her before you, he's not going to let me marry you before you marry her." So therefore he said, "Okay, so the way to circumvent this is, when he tries to trick me, I will have special signs between you and me, and this way I'll be able to identify on the night who it is, whether it's you or Leah." So they said, so that they gave each other signs, right? Or he gave her signs. And then on the night when, in fact, Lavan gave Leah instead of Rachel, she said, "Oh no, my sister is going to be put to shame because Yaakov is going to ask her for signs and she's not going to know them." So she gave over the signs. And this way, when it says in the Pasuk, "And came to pass in the morning, and behold, it was Leah," it means that during the night he had no idea that wasn't Leah because she had the signs. And because of this modesty, she, in other words, she was willing to give up her right to marry this tzaddik, so as not to embarrass her sister. As a result of that, she merited to have Shaul, who was modest. Now, what was the modesty of Shaul? It's that when he came back to tell his uncle about what had happened when he went to find the donkeys, he didn't come and say that he was appointed king. He kept that secret, and because he wanted to be modest, and as a result of that, he merited Esther, who descended from him, and she too was modest. So, since the Gemara cited the Rebbe Elazar's interpretation of the beginning of the verse, which says "La yigra mitzadik eino," that Hashem does not withdraw his eye from the righteous. So it goes on to say the interpretation of the end of the verse. Rebbe Elazar says that when Hashem assigns greatness to a person, he assigns it to his descendants for all generations. Like it says, he establishes them forever, and they are exalted. But if, as a result of his greatness, this person becomes arrogant or haughty, right, then Hashem is going to lower him, like it says in the next verse. And if they are bound, and if they are bound in chains, etc., which means that if they are, if they're going to be arrogant, then it's not going to end positively. So now, the Gemara continues with the Megillah, which says that Mordechai did what Esther did what Mordechai had commanded upon her. So Rabbi Yirmiyah says that what that means is that when she ever had any menstrual blood, she went and she showed it to Mordechai to be able to determine when she could start going to the mikvah and be clean. So when it says just as she was when she was raised with him, that teaches us that what? That she used to rise from the bosom of Achashverosh and immerse herself and then sit in the bosom of Mordechai, which means to say that she remained married to Mordechai. She's sleeping with another man. It was against her will. And since it was against her will, the halacha is that if a woman was forced against her will to lie with another man, so long as the husband is not a kohen, she's allowed to still go back and be married to her husband. And that's exactly what happened with Mordechai and Esther and Achashverosh. Okay. The Gemara continues. It says in those days, in the Megillah, it says in those days that while Achashverosh was sitting at the king's gate, Bigsan and Seresh became angry. What happened? So Rabbi Chia Ba'aba said, in the name of Rabbi Yechanan, that we find in at least 2 cases that Hashem caused the master to become angry with his servants in order to fulfill the will of a righteous man. Who's that referring to? That's referring to Yosef. Parai became angry with the butler and the baker, and it was all for the sake of the Nar Ivri, which was Yosef, and Hashem causes the servants to be angry at their master in order to perform a miracle for the righteous. Who's that referring to? That's referring to Mordechai. How do we know? Because we find that Bigsan and Seresh became angry with Haman. Became angry with Achashverosh, which ultimately led to Mordechai having a miracle take place because he saved the king. Right? So now, continuing with the story, right? Rabbi Yechanan says that Bigsan and Seresh were from Tarshish, and they were speaking in their native language, and they said that from this day that Esther came to the palace, we haven't gotten any sleep. Why? Because Achashverosh was busy with her. And they're like, this is ridiculous. So therefore, what we're going to do is we're going to poison the bowl from which Achashverosh drinks, and then he'll die. Now, they didn't realize that Mordechai, who was part of the Sanhedrin, knew 70 languages. Since he knew 70 languages, so he was able to understand what they said. So the conversation between them continued and said, listen, the problem we have is how are we going to be able to carry out this plot if your post and my post are not the same? So they said, listen, I'll guard your post, right? And you go and you do and you poison it. And this is what it's written, that the matter was investigated and it was found out that they were not found at their posts. And that's how it was discovered that this plot had indeed taken place. And it was Bigsan and Seresh that were behind it. They were the culprits. The Megillah continues, after these things, after what? After what things was Haman given this ascension to power? So the Gemara says, Robert says that this is a very important teaching, that we have to realize that anytime Hashem causes an affliction, he creates the remedy before the affliction, right? So here, the story with Bigsan and Seresh was already the seeds of how there would be a remedy. For Rish Lakish says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Blessed One, does not smite Israel unless he created a remedy for them beforehand. Like it says, when I heal Israel, then the iniquity of Ephraim will be revealed. Meaning, only then will they be punished. But the nations of the world, that's not the case. First, Hashem smites them, and only afterwards does he create a remedy for them. Like it says, and Hashem will smite Egypt, smiting and healing. The go for a fight. So first it's smiting and then healing. But for the Jewish people, first Hashem creates a remedy before he creates the affliction. Then it continues to say about Haman that it seemed contemptible in the eyes of him to lay hands on Haman alone. So the verse mentions Mordechai, then the people of Mordechai, and then all the Jewish people. So the Gemara says, what this is teaching us, Rava says, what this is teaching is that first Haman wanted to destroy Mordechai. And then he wanted to destroy the people of Mordechai. And who are the people of Mordechai? This refers to the Chachamim, the rabbis. And at the end, he said, I want to destroy all of the Jews. I want to destroy all of the Jews. Okay, the Megillah continues and he says that he made a lottery, right? And what happened? So the Brisa tells us what happened was when Haman saw that the Goyrol fell out in the month of Adar, the lottery fell out in the month of Adar, he was very happy. Why was he very happy? Because he said that the lottery fell out for me on the month in which Moshe died. Moshe died in Adar. And he felt that this is a very unlucky month for the Jewish people. So therefore he felt confident that he was going to prevail. But he didn't realize that on the 7th day of Adar, Moshe died. And on the 7th day of Adar, he was born. So it was in fact not considered to be an inauspicious month for the Jewish people. In fact, it was an inauspicious month because this was the day that he was born as well. The Megillah continues and says as follows. When Haman comes along and speaks about the Jewish people to Achashverosh, he says, Yeshnai Am Echad, there's a certain nation. Says Rava, there's no one who knows how to slander as skillfully as Haman. What did he say? He said to Achashverosh as follows. He says, come and let us destroy the Jews. Achashverosh says, what do you mean? I'm afraid of their God. I don't want him to do to me as he did to my predecessors. You know, look at what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. Look what happened to Belshazzar. You know, they started up with the Jews and it didn't end well for them, right? So he says, so Haman said to Achashverosh that not Yeshnoi, but Yoshnu. You can, again, in Hebrew, right, there are no vowels written into the text. The vowels are part of the tradition, right, and transmitted orally. So the word Yeshnoi Am Echad could be translated as Yoshnu. They slept. What does that mean? It means they've been negligent from the mitzvahs. And since they've been negligent from the mitzvahs, you don't have to worry because Hashem is not going to save them from you because they've been negligent with the mitzvahs. Achashverosh said, but 1 second, what about their rabbis? They have rabbis who they do keep the mitzvahs. So he says, Am Echad, they're one nation, which means to say, right? One second. What that means is that although it looks like the rabbis are keeping the mitzvahs, right? They're one nation. The rabbis equally don't keep them, just like the rest of the people. That's what Haman was slandering the Jewish people. Then he says, well, 1 second, perhaps you're going to think that by killing out the Jewish people, I'll make a bold spot in your kingdom, meaning a section of your kingdom will be depopulated once I remove all the Jewish people. So don't worry about that. It's not the problem because they're scattered abroad among the nations. You might say that there might be some benefit that you could get from them. So it's not profitable to destroy them. So he says that this is not the case because Mephirad, they are like a mule, right? This is a different way of reading it, right? They're like a preda, right? Which is a mule, which does not bear any fruit, meaning they're unproductive, right? Which is not much has changed, right? The anti-Semitic claims against the Jews seem to have remained static. The same things that they say. So then he continued and says, you might think that there's a small province is made up of them, and you don't want to destroy one of your provinces by destroying them. He says, no, that the Jews are in all the provinces of your kingdom. And then he continues and he says, they're loads of different from all other nations. What does that mean? That they do not eat from our food, and they do not marry our women, and they do not let women marry us. And he continues, he says, and they do not observe the king's laws, which means to say they waste the whole year. They waste a whole year avoiding king's work by saying today is Shabbos, today is Pesach, right? The acronym over here is B'Shahi and Pehi, B'Shabbos Hayom and Pesach Hayom. That the point is, every day they're claiming it's another Jewish holiday in the calendar, right? And Haman continued and he says, so therefore, it's no benefit for the king to tolerate them. Why? Because they eat and drink and then mock the throne, right? How do they mock the throne? Because if a fly falls into their glass of wine, they cast the fly away and they still drink the wine, right? But if my master, the king, would touch a glass of their wine, what would they do? Is that they would throw the ground and they wouldn't drink it. They wouldn't drink it because it's yain nesach. You can't drink yain nesach. You can't have that kind of wine. And so he claimed that this was a direct affront to the king. And then he continues. He says, if it pleases the king, let it be written to destroy them, and I'll give 10,000 talents of silver. Right. So Rish Lakish says that it was clearly known in advance before Hashem that Haman was destined to weigh out shkolim to destroy the Jewish people. Therefore, Hashem caused the Jewish people to precede their shkolim with before Haman's shkolim by giving the machzah shekel, and that's what we learn in the Mishnah, right? When it says on the first of Adar, the Sanhedrin would proclaim regarding the payment of the shkolim and regarding kilayim. And I'll just do one more line to be able to finish the page. So it says, and the king said to Haman, "Hakesev nosan loch," right? That the silver is given to you, and the nation is also given to you to do whatever you want. So Rabbi said about this, and we'll conclude with this. The example of Achashverosh and Haman is what is comparable to two people, one who had a mound of dirt in his field and the other one who had a ditch in his field. So the one who had the ditch says, I wish somebody would give me this mound and I'll pay for it. The one who had a mound said, only if I wish the owner of the ditch would give me the use of this ditch in exchange for payment. What happened? They met up with one another. The owner says to the ditch, sell me your mound. And the owner of the mound says to him, you know what, take it for free. And I wish you would just take it for free. And that's exactly what happened with Achashverosh and Haman, that they wished to destroy the Jewish people. So when Haman offered to purchase the right to do so, Achashverosh says, hey, take it for free. I don't need your money. And we will stop here. And may all those who start up against the Jewish people have the same outcome as Haman did. And may Hashem bring Shuvah Tzolach for all the Jewish people. Amen. All right. Thanks to everybody.
Take care. Thank you.